Okay, we're underway. Good morning, everyone. Thank you ever so much for joining us for this special, exclusive 1 hour webinar about data visualization careers and professional development. And it's a real pleasure to welcome an esteemed panel of guests from around the field, different characteristics which have been deliberately pulled together for giving you folks attending today, who I know are amongst my and Kieran's data viz module, but also potentially the wider School of Management at UCL, to give you folks a sense of, I guess, the ultimate question, which is the end game. You know, why do you do qualifications like a master's degree? Well, you do it to try and progress your career. So we're going to try and give you a sense of the opportunities that exist, the kind of skills and knowledge you need to possess to be able to operate in this field, but also some of the backstories from our panel, because we all come from different origins. We've all got different origin stories, and I think it's very helpful sometimes to learn that this isn't just a very obvious linear straight line into this world. There's all sorts of curves and different bends in the road. So it's something that I think, as a summary point to start with, we can all get into and we can all succeed in. So joining me today, and just for those of you who don't know me, my name's Andy Kirk. I'm a freelance data viz design consultant, educator consultant. I'm teaching with Kyran on the data viz module, and it's a real pleasure to be able to do that. I'm also delighted to welcome, and we'll let them introduce themselves very shortly, but Lyndsey Pereira-Brereton, currently at Flourish, but seconded from the Bank of England. Welcome to you, Lyndsey. We've got Dr. Cath Sleeman from Nesta, Alan Smith from the Financial Times, Valentina D'Efilippo, who's also a freelancer like myself, and of course Kyran, who's my collaborator on the data viz module. So welcome to you all, and thank you all so much for giving up your time. So just to kick off with, just maybe we'll go through the panel just to get some quick intros, perhaps about your roles today, you know, what your occupations are, and then we'll move on shortly to look at backstory. So Lyndsey, can I start with you to give yourself a quick brief introduction, please?
Yeah, no problem, Andy. Nice to meet you all, even if I can't see you. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about my career and my job. It's quite nice to reflect on these things. So my name's Lyndsey. I work at the Bank of England. I've worked there for the last 10 years, and my current role is the data viz editor in the communications team there. So it focuses on improving the bank's external communication of our data and analysis through graphics and visual representation. But in September, I left on a one-year secondment to work at Flourish, which is a software company, a data visualization storytelling software company. And mainly because I was using Flourish at the Bank of England, and I loved the product so much, and I wanted to kind of add a few more strings to my bow. So I'm now at Flourish, and I head up the services team there, so working with clients on custom projects or consultancy, and yeah, and just growing that area for the next 9 months of my secondment. So that's me.
Fantastic, great stuff. And we'll learn a little bit more about Flourish, I think, later on, Lyndsey, because I think it's certainly a tool that I've been mentioning to the folks on the course. I think its growth over the last maybe 2 years in particular has been fantastic to see. So thank you, Lyndsey. Cath, we'll come to you next. Hi.
Hi there, I'm Cath Sleeman. I work for Nesta. I'm head of data discovery there within the kind of data science team. And my role is all about discovering new sources of novel and open data, combining that with machine learning, and then using data visualization to communicate the insights from that. So kind of showcasing the potential of kind of unused data sets and showing how they can be used to kind of address some of the biggest challenges that we're facing. So Nesta is an innovation charity, and we focus on kind of promoting innovation in 3 areas: a sustainable kind of green recovery, healthy lives, and reducing inequality in early childhood. And then for, I'd say the last few years, my focus has mostly been on improving labour market information. So yeah, that's me. And yeah.
Thanks, Cath, and we'll learn a bit more about your journey into that world in a short while. Alan, to you next. Good morning, sir.
Hi, Andy. Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name's Alan, and so I run the visual and data journalism team at the Financial Times. Now, that is a collective group in the newsroom at the FT that encompasses everything from the traditional graphics desk and kind of stats desks that you would find in the FT newsroom going back, decades, along with data journalism and interactive design. So it's a collective group of interdisciplinary people with various backgrounds that we use to inject visuals and data into all of our FT reporting. And obviously, we can talk about this later, but the last year, of course, has probably accelerated the role of that team in all sorts of ways in terms of its importance to the newsroom.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a staggering story on that front, Alan. Yeah, we'll learn more about that in a short while. Next to Valentina. Hi, Val.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Andy. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Valentina D'Efilippo. I'm an information designer. I work independently. I set up my own limited company in 2011, and since then I've been working across a variety of projects with clients, big and small, from startups to big agencies. And yeah, I guess the common denominator of all my projects is data, whether it's data visualization, infographic storytelling, or perhaps just using data as a material for innovating, so creating new experiences through data. Yeah, so sector agnostic, format agnostic, from print to digital to experiential, bringing data visualization inside theatre performances is a lot of fun.
Fantastic. I think that's a key word as well, about fun, because I do feel, don't get me wrong, there are some dreadfully boring tasks that you still need to do. A lot of those, actually. I'm just looking at my to-do list and thinking, oh my word, Thursday afternoon's not looking a great fun afternoon, but in lots of ways, it is a very fun world to be in, I think. Thanks, Vali. And last but not least, Kyran. Good morning, sir.
Hi, good morning, sir. Yeah, I'm a reject from academia. I think it's quite common, and it leaves you generally, if you have any saleable skills, it's programming, and I had done a lot of that, and I became a kind of a freelancer. I was looking to use those skills to travel. So I did a lot of, I think it's called digital nomadism these days. In those days, it was just have Wi-Fi, will travel. And the idea was to have a portable skill. And after a while, I got bored of continually getting just lots and lots of very different projects and very different skills being required. And I thought, find a niche. And I'd done a lot of data visualization in academia, and it made a lot of sense, and I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the challenge. So I thought, well, go for it. And I just started giving talks and building visualizations. And these days, I think the truth of freelancing, certainly for me, is most work comes from word of mouth. So I have a small kind of network, and people will very rarely kind of contact you cold. That's one thing I think it's worth pointing out. And I get just lots of very interesting jobs. Occasionally you get a big job, like I worked for Government Digital Services for a while, and that was a 2-year kind of consultancy. You get a lot of little jobs. If you're lucky, you get to do a bit of kind of rinse and repeat. You get to actually reuse your skill set. But a lot of the time you're just learning by the seat of your pants, because as everyone here knows, it's an incredibly fast moving area. And if you're certainly if you're doing front end web development, it changes very fast. So it's hard to predict, but generally you just get these little jobs, maybe a month or two, using a new tool, and a lot of obviously a lot of business orientated data panels and various other stuff, and I guess dashboards, the horror of dashboards, but it's a skill like any other. So yeah, toss a coin. I could be doing anything, but a job in the kind of web dev field, I think.
Great stuff. Thanks, Kyran. And it's great to hear the intros, and I think it'll be even more interesting to hear the backstories, which is what we'll move on to next. And again, just to mention for those attending, if you've got any questions, you're very welcome to drop them into the chat panel or into the more sort of structured Q&A panel on Zoom. We may not answer it at that moment in time if it's something that we're going to cover later on. but we'll also leave a bit of time at the end to kind of wrap up any questions and answers that do exist. So yeah, I think backstories. So when I asked my students to raise any questions before the session about things they were keen to learn about, the kind of backstories, you know, we are here now, we just talked about what we do, but how's that story evolved and how did we end up doing what we do? And I'll go in the same order in a second, but just to give a very quick sense of sort of my backstory. Now, as a kid, and now you're thinking, God, how long's this story going to be? But yes, as a kid, I was really into art and maths, and I wanted to be an architect, but I was crap at physics. So that killed off that route. What it meant, though, was, I guess when I moved beyond university, I was always drawn towards roles that had a degree of creativity, but sort of fundamental basis of maths and stats and data. And so I worked for a few organisations like CIS Insurance and West Yorkshire Police and the University of Leeds as an analyst, information manager, communications manager. And so I was always working with data. I was always doing presentations. I was always doing charts, but my word, looking back, the things I was making, whew, I used all the different textures in Excel, like wood-based 3D bar charts were a thing. And then 2007, I discovered this subject by chance. I was browsing through the web to find some advice on sort of radar charts, and I found a white paper from Stephen Few. And it was the first time I saw any discourse about this as a subject. And it was a light bulb moment, a genuine sort of, right, this is the thing I want to focus on. So long story short, I did a master's degree at the University of Leeds whilst I was working as a member of staff, sort of part-time research-driven master's. Did it in data viz, loved it, thought, right, I need to continue this. Started the blog. So I think one of the things we'll talk about in terms of tactics, getting a profile, getting a public profile, whether that's work or whether that's writing, whether that's just for networking, it just gives you a little bit of a prominence. And Kyran mentioned how few gigs come his way through cold calling. And actually the only gigs that I do get are either through word of mouth or people have come across my work. I don't sort of go and find them. And so, yeah, I started the blog, got a few inquiries for work. My first client was Walmart in Arkansas. And to be honest, once I got them as a first client and their logo, it was a starting point that kind of just generated itself thereafter. Went freelance, part-time initially. Within 1 week, it was obvious I need to go full-time. Eventually took 6 months to get to that point, but that was 2011 when I went freelance, so about 10 years now. And, you know, I'm thankful I got into this world, and perhaps we'll touch on in a second the changes of the last decade, but I got into the world when it was just moving from the fringes into a more mainstream context. And I think I grew with the field and the opportunities that came my way. So that's my backstory. I'll come to you, Lyndsey, because obviously you've got a new little strand in your career lineage.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not going to start in my childhood because that feels like a very long time ago. But a couple of pivotal things that kind of set me off on this direction. One was choosing economics at A-level at school, which was a subject not very popular with other people and I'd say women in general. And that I just loved it so much because I think I'm very much a visual learner and everything in economics is understandable in graphs. So that kind of just set me off on my little journey, and then pursued economics throughout university as an undergrad and then as a master's. I loved it so much. It explained the world to me. I always have so many questions. So having a kind of framework and a way of thinking about things from that subject was, really suited my personality. And then I got to have to find a job. And I didn't really want to go into banking. I wasn't really that kind of person. I didn't want to be an accountant. And so there wasn't very much left apart from looking into the government economic service. So I got a position as a kind of assistant economist in DWP. And I stayed there for quite a long time. And then I needed a bit of a change, so I saw a position at the Bank of England, and I started getting much more into data, and I worked in the data team there. And then I moved into advanced analytics, which was a new area for the bank, which was doing some of the Cath was saying about text mining and machine learning. But my specialism, I started to specialize in data visualization, and a kind of another pivotal moment was finding Tableau, which was quite a new software back then in 2011, I think. And I just loved the kind of visual analysis. I just loved finding interesting things in data by dragging and dropping stuff and telling people, did you know this was happening? And they've been looking at their data for years and years and hadn't seen something odd or an interesting pattern. So that was another pivotal moment. And I'd say teaching myself Tableau was kind of the defining moment in starting to specialize data viz. And I decided that I'm not really a data scientist, or I don't really want to learn Python to do machine learning, but I really loved the storytelling and communication aspects of data visualization, mainly because analysts are really bad at it. And it seems like such a shame because they do great work. They spend so much time doing amazing analysis, and then they just explain it so terribly that no one cares or understands what they're trying to say, and it just kind of flops. So I thought, well, surely we must be spending much more time on this end point, which is the bit where people listen and make decisions based on your work. So then I slowly moved into communications at the bank, which is quite a big change, but was also instigated by Mark Carney, who at the time was the governor of the Bank of England, and he was very hot on communication. I mean, he's quite a smooth character, very charismatic, presents himself well, and he really realized the value of great communication in a kind of era of fake news and people mistrusting experts. And he put a very strong focus on communication at the Bank of England, causing a huge shift in what we kind of focused on. And that created my role as the data viz editor. So I led on that. Hopefully made some big changes on how the bank communicates data, awful Excel charts in PDFs that haven't changed in 20 years. And so, yeah, so that was kind of my journey. And then I realized I'm terrible at coding. I'm not a coder. I'm never going to be a web developer, but I wanted to make my charts much more fun and interactive, and web is the way forward. And so I was looking for a tool that did a bit more than Tableau, like something that made your stories really beautiful and engaging, and was kind of web-based. And that's when I found Flourish, and then the rest is history. So now I can kind of indulge in my more creative parts of my personality, which were a bit more kind of stagnant in the Bank of England, and with an analytical background. And I can learn lots from web developers on the kind of technical side of developing software and product features. So it's very exciting. So I kind of tell Flourish, I'm a customer in their midst. So I'm the voice of their customer. And I'm like, no, stop developing this. That's not interesting to me. This is what the customer would like to be able to do. So it's good fun, but it's very, very, very different. So going from a 350-year institution to a tech startup that's growing at pace, so it's a big change, but a very fun one. But I'll stop talking to everyone else.
No, that's okay, Lyndsey. I mean, I think there's a few points there that strike me. First of all, I mean, you mentioned that you're not a programmer, and I mean, I can dabble, but I would also put myself more in that camp than, you know, Kyran's camp in particular. And I think it's a worthwhile point making for those listening and watching, that you can succeed in this career without having to code. If you can code, brilliant, fantastic. And coding is not just about making things look nice at the end. It's about automating things, gathering data, automating the analysis of it. But yeah, I mean, I think this strap line for Flourish is something like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe it's a little test for you as well. Beautiful, bespoke, visualizations without programming or something along those
Yes.
lines.
Yes.
I think is the strapline for Flourish.
Yes.
So I think Flourish is in this space now, which is perhaps the most challenging space technology-wise, to give people without the programming skills tools that will do complex, sophisticated things simply. And I think that's the hardest thing to do, because you still want to have that expressiveness to do as many different things and as control as many different things as possible. And I think Flourish is trying to bite off the most difficult market, but it's doing it very well. And I think it's it's definitely a tool that's hopefully here to stay. So thank you, Lyndsey. I'll come to you next, Cath. Just again, a sort of a sense of your backstory and how you've ended up where you are now.
So I studied economics at university, and then I spent 4 years at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, so the equivalent of the Bank of England. And I worked there on things like modelling and forecasting, but also helping to write little bits, admittedly, of the kind of inflation report equivalent, so called the monetary policy statement. But then I came over here to Cambridge to do a master's, and I thought after that I'd perhaps try working in the private sector for a time. Though the day I landed in the UK was the day Lehman Brothers collapsed. That was right at the start of the financial crisis. So
not your fault, Cath.
But also not great timing on my part. So I spent most of my master's looking for a job, but I was very, very lucky. And so I became an economist at Morgan Stanley, and I spent 2 years there. And I think kind of what I learned there was kind of how to do things very quickly. So if a piece of data comes out, you need to give a comment to it via kind of a broadcasting system, kind of within a minute, and then you need an email within half an hour, and then a kind of a full report within a couple of hours. So I think those are some of the skills I kind of picked up there. But I always know I knew, because the masters had been so much fun, really, I knew I wanted to go back to Cambridge to do a PhD. So I did that, and then I guess during the PhD I started to code in something called Fortran in MATLAB, which I wouldn't recommend. not Fortran at least. But I think that's where I found that it wasn't as big of a hurdle as I perhaps I had in my mind, kind of coding. And then I got a job at Nesta, and I wasn't more as a kind of, I think it was quantitative research fellow, so more doing economics, but we had a series of interns at Nesta, and one of them was in computer science, and I was just chatting to him one day, and he showed me D3 and what it could do, and it must have been like version 2 or 3, it was quite early on, but I thought it was wonderful, but I didn't have a clue how web pages worked or how the internet kind of what web development was, but I kind of plugged away at it and kind of produced some very awful looking like data visualizations, and I really just went from there, because they started, people that liked them, even even though now I'd look back and think, oh gosh, that's terrible, but it kind of worked, and so I spent more time doing data visualization, and yeah, I think that's my story.
So do you think then, Cath, that in a sense your visualization skills emerged almost after your kind of coding skills were developed? Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, interesting.
And I don't think what I was coding were kind of economic models, so the kind of the programming languages and what I was coding didn't help at all with the visualization, but I think it gave me the confidence to know that I could pick it up. I think. Yeah, and I think
what's interesting about that though is that you've got your work's got a very strong visual style. I mean, I can spot a Cath Sleeman piece from a mile away.
Because you're like blinded by the colours.
Oh, you love the colours. Let's face that. Yeah, but it's good. It's nice stuff. So I'm curious then about because this is a kind of question that we'll come on to later on, but we might as well pick it up now. How do you get your inspiration in terms of developing your style? Because it's obviously one way is through practice, but I mean, do you look out at other kind of economist type products and think, right, do different to that, or be inspired by that, or is it just something that's developed organically?
I think probably a little bit organically, a little bit from our house style. So if you look at the Nesta website, it's kind of similar, right? It's quite bold and kind of heavily saturated colours. And I think, yeah, perhaps a little bit personal style. So I love going in normal times to all the art galleries looking at abstract art. And I think I also enjoy painting and drawing as well. And I think it's got to give you joy, the data visualization, doesn't it? Otherwise, you wouldn't want to kind of keep going with it. So yeah, I think it's got to give you kind of some pleasure, and I guess the color, bright colors and things are a way to do that. So bright colors, kind of, and those kind of very geometric shapes, I'd say. You can kind of see my living room.
And I think that's, again, you touched on the phrase there, joy, and I think one of the things that's interesting, just before we jump on to Alan's story, and Alan might pick up on this, given Alan's experience in this field, it feels to me that we've had a shift in style of work over the last 5 to 10 years, where 10 years ago, it was very much about precision. It was about obeying the rules. And if you didn't obey the rules, you were shouted at by people in the field, not by me, hopefully. But I think the last 5 years or so, there's been maybe a liberation, a sense of freedom, a kind of opening of gooiness and sketchiness and colours and imprecision and gist. And I think it's evolved to a place now which is far more joyous in terms of style. And let's not forget that the recipients of this thing is people, and people like nice things. I think it is maturing now to a really nice space. And when we come to Valentina as well, I think, Valentina, you'll sort of speak to that, kind of extra fluency that maybe comes through your work. But to Alan, your backstory is very interesting, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely start in the last century. So my undergraduate degree was in geography, and I joined the Office for National Statistics effectively as a GIS analyst, okay, because I'd done GIS, so Geographic Information Systems, as a part of my undergrad. So I joined a statistics office and very quickly ended up running the publication mapping service there. So things like choropleth maps in statistical publications were sort of my bread and butter. And while I was there, I really started to sense that the internet might catch on and it might stay around for a while. So I thought I'd better have a look at how to do maps on the internet. And one of the first things that I found was that there was this thing called SVG emerging in the web space, which would allow you to produce vector maps in a web browser as long as you could code it, right? So that was where I went home for like a month and just forced myself to learn how to write JavaScript, having never previously developed. I thought, I have a very clear idea of what I want to do here, which is to produce some really nice cartography on the web. That turned into a master's that I did while I was still working at ONS. And I basically did a master's in GIS, specializing in web cartography. And the thesis for that, that I did for that, was really, it was designed to annoy my tutors, actually, because I basically said, do we need GIS anymore, was the sort of question of my thesis, which was, can you do small area, high quality cartography on the internet without using any GIS software? Because this was at a time before Google Maps, when you had to go buy things like Esri software, expensive software, to be able to do anything. It was all massively complicated. So I did a project mapping the indices of deprivation for my master's thesis, which ONS, the statistics office, actually ended up publishing as a product because they were very happy with it. And then that led me to sort of the pivotal moment, really, which is that I wrote a business case to the board of ONS saying, I'm really glad you like this little interactive map. There is nothing in this technology that is specific to mapping. We should set up a dedicated team looking at how we can use this emerging technology to transform the way we present statistics. And if we do that, then we'll be able to capture a much wider audience than this statistics office is normally aimed at. And I had some fun with that because, you know, at the time I sort of used to joke that, you know, the URL statistics.gov.uk was two of people's least favorite words in that single URL. So the big benefit of investing in that for us was to produce content that we could syndicate, so that we could do some really nice, immersive, interactive visuals, and then basically say to all of our friends in the press, hey, do you want some cool interactive stuff for free for your website? We can syndicate this stuff to you. So we set up a dedicated data visualization team. We very quickly started pulling together like a portfolio of interactive web graphics. I went and started talking to the press, and places like the BBC and the Telegraph were very kind and kind of helped us draw a lot of attention to the work in a way that we couldn't have done if we'd have just stayed in our own sort of domain. And then I guess the sort of inevitable happened, which is that I ended up getting to know some of the press people very, very well. And one of those organizations, the Financial Times, said, hey, guess what? You know, your work has kind of convinced us that what we really need now is a data visualization editor at the FT. So I kind of made this curious hop from the world of the civil service to the international newsroom, which was a little bit of a change of pace. Is probably the kindest way of describing it. You know, look, you're going from a place which is used to doing a census every 10 years to a news organization which is working globally around the clock, you know. So it's a very different environment, but the challenge actually has been largely the same, which is, here's an organization that's done things in a certain way for a long time. How can you arrive with data visualization and use it to sort of transform and kind of enhance the quality work that's already going on? And so that is, as much as a sort of technical challenge, it's a very sort of human challenge about how do you introduce change into organizations, you know, for example, without feeling threatening, you know, to people, without, you know, making people feel like, oh, great, these smart kids are coming in and telling me how to do things. And of course, I wasn't a kid at the time, so it probably quite helped that my hair was graying already when I arrived. But it's a change journey as much as it is a technical kind of challenge. And 2 years ago, my job title changed again. So I was data visualization editor, which was the first time they'd ever had a data visualization editor, which I think is an interesting sort of observation that it's arrived as a function. And rather like Lyndsey, you know, these are job titles that these organizations have not had before. And now I'm head of visual and data journalism, where the challenge is to keep building on the work that we've done on data visualization, but to make sure that we don't only do that at the expense of all of the other use of visuals and multimedia elements, because we've got great kind of artists and graphic designers and people who are coming to the newsroom from very, very different backgrounds. And so that's actually helped me, because my background is also different. I didn't do a traditional journalism degree. And so there's a lot of people working in my team who've come to end up doing lovely data visualization work from very, very different backgrounds that they probably wouldn't have anticipated at the time that they graduated. I think that's a really interesting point, is that I think we're seeing something right now in terms of people. It's great that you've got so many people on these courses now, because those courses themselves didn't exist at the time that I was thinking about career options. So I hope that means that, like you say, the field has matured. The skills are becoming much more rigorous. There's a lot more diversity in the kind of applications for data visualization that there used to be. And I'm kind of lucky that I can still apply myself to a lot of that, you know, which I think is quite interesting about that role.
I think there's interesting points, Sir Alan, about the sort of similarities that Lyndsey mentioned that you picked up on about the, you know, this real sort of dinosaur organization in terms of, you know, not changed, not evolved, perhaps as fast as other organizations had, and the, you know, the non-technical challenges that you face to change the kind of hearts and minds and kind of the embracing of this stuff. And I think one of the things I really want to kind of get across in this session to people watching is that there's so much in this whole visualization game that is not technical. It's so human, and it's so much about communication, and it's so much about listening. And it's not just about what you say, it's about listening to others, listening to experts. And I mean, one of the questions, just to quickly pick up with you again, Alan, from Christina, she was curious about the way that the journalists at the FT kind of work with the visual people. And I know that the blurring of those distinctions is ever more growing because people have multiple hats these days. But how does the kind of editorial process work? You know, how do the visual people end up making something visual? Is it the journalist comes to them and says, make me this, which I think you're going to say is the old school method? Or is it much more about working together collaboratively from the start and finding opportunities? Yeah,
so I mean, the thing you've just kind of suggested as a workflow is fairly traditional in a newsroom, right? Like if you were doing a journalism degree 20 years ago, there would be a book that would tell you, right, this is the way that a newsroom is organized, and this is how a story is, kind of the gestation period of a story will usually involve the graphics desk as a sort of last stop prior to publication. So basically a real journalist will have written, 1,000 words, it will have been edited, and then an editor would say to the graphics desk, you know what, we need 1 or 2 graphics dropped into this story. Okay, that's a very traditional workflow. The thing that was interesting about that is that under that model, reporters are generally discouraged from talking to the graphics people. Right? Like it's an editor's call to make that decision. That's one of the big changes that we've implemented in the last few years, is we've basically said a couple of things. One is, actually, you know what, my team are journalists, right, in their own right, because we're here as storytellers, which is what journalism is all about. And we just are using all sorts of different assets, including text, to help tell that story. And so what we've tried to do is to encourage our other beat reporters to engage with my team at the earliest moment, because as well as I do, Andy, just over the years we've talked about this, and I'm sure it comes across with people like, Cath's work as well, that the visualization of data is only one element of your use of data in an analysis, right? Like the very first, you can't completely disassociate the visualization task from, what's the question I'm trying to answer here? What data is going to help me answer that question? Do I need to do some analysis to be able to do that hasn't previously been done? So to actually go through that process as part of the reporting phase is, something that I think is now much more conventional, and something like coronavirus has been a classic for that. You can't just drop a graphic in at the end of a coronavirus story, right? Like, because you need to understand the data to write about it, right? So that has changed. Having said that, of course, it varies. We've got about 600 journalists at the FT. And so there are some journalists that we work with very, very closely on collaborative stories. There are some pieces that we execute entirely on our own. And there are still some that come through a fairly traditional workflow for a number of reasons, because you can't change everything at the same time.
Brilliant. Yeah, and there's some other points I want to pick up on that in a second, when we look at the kind of state of the field, the marketplace, and the opportunities that exist. But thanks, Alan. Moving on to Valentina. So Valentina, like myself and Kyran, you're a freelancer, unlike these other proper job people.
Exactly.
And you've been freelancing for about the same time as I have. But again, what's the sort of backstory?
I could actually relate a lot to your story, Andy. I could see myself in the kind of like evolution. So really, like, it goes back to deciding what to focus on, whether it was science or art. And I always had a really hard time deciding between these two. You need to know that actually in Italy, when you're 14, you must pick a subject of focus already, which is really early on. And I couldn't decide. So I went for art. And then after 2 years, I was 16, I was like, oh no, I really don't want to miss out on science. So I spent my entire summer studying Latin. That was part of the scientific program and not of the artistic program, which totally sucked. It was such a bummer, like you're 16 and you're spending all your summer studying Latin every day. because I wanted to make the jump and transition to science, and so I did. But then again, at university, I had again a really hard time deciding, do I go for architecture, art? I went for engineering. So I did study industrial design. And kind of like the engineering focus it seemed to be the most artistic, perhaps, course that I could take. And perhaps was also like a lack of creative role models around me. They gave me, you know, the confidence to really embrace the creative route. Yeah, it was not until 2006 when I finished my degree in industrial design that I was like, okay, I really need to pursue art now. That's really the thing that I'm still lacking. So I looked for a program that allowed me to kind of like jump into visual communication and visual arts. And I came to London. I did my postgraduate in visual communication, and during this course, I experimented with different medium and formats, and really was information design the one that attracted me the most, and perhaps was this kind of like good compromise on the maybe more scientific and problem-solving aspect of how to display information complexity in an accessible form, but also the creative language. Nice typography, aesthetics, good balance, and all of that. So yeah, it was a journey to just even identify myself in some sort of like field. And then after that, definitely it's not been linear. I landed my first job in advertising. I worked as a digital art director for a number of years, but I soon realized that really advertising wasn't for me. However, it was a really good starting point just to learn survival skills to become a professional, you know, like how to work with other people, how to get a good grip on the time and effort involved for any sort of like project. So yeah, like a great kind of like gym, I suppose, to train the creative muscle, but also just endurance of surviving. And yeah, I was really lucky that in 2011, I decided to go on my own, freelancing, because I had built a good network of people during those years in advertising. And I was really just seeking like projects that suited me more in terms of like the content, the type of experimentation, the type of projects. And I was really fortunate to land a book opportunity with HarperCollins. So I embarked into this journey of creating 100 infographics with James Ball, a data journalist, narrating the history and evolution of mankind and the world. And this is like really the first proper experience working with data. I mean, throughout university and the years before that, I did play around with data with an analysis of gender stereotypes or a deconstruction of Kubrick, but I wasn't quite aware that I was working with data. But it's during the book that I really cemented my experience, and I learned a lot by just doing it. So kind of like self-taught, really. Learning how to create a pivot table. I remember like, what is a pivot table? But yeah, so after the book, obviously lots of like new opportunities came my way in terms of like collaborating with clients and agencies, and most of the briefs did involve a layer of data. And yeah, that's how I got here.
And do you think that when you came to do the visual arts course, were you thinking at that stage kind of longer term about the career opportunities that would open the door for, or was it just because you had a passion for it and you'll see what happens next, but your focus was just on the course because you love that stuff?
Yeah, I definitely could not see myself working with data at that point. I didn't even know there was a thing. At that point, really, the decision was just because I was always craving to really explore more my creative side, but I never perhaps had the courage to fully embrace that. So I got to a point where I was like, okay, now I'm really ready to explore visual arts. And at that point, I was really experimenting with many different medium and kind of like visual arts as well, from photography to letterpress, all sorts of things. But it was really like this, the information design module that really clicked on me, and that's why I decided to focus my thesis for the degree on information design, visualizing gender stereotypes for books, for illustrated books for kids.
Interesting. We'll come back in a second, Valentina, about freelancing and kind of what goes into that. But just to thank you very much. Moving on to Kyran, your backstory, sir.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I was getting the odd kind of familiar frisson from Valentina's story, because mine's been fairly circuitous. I started a maths degree sometime in the primordial, 2000s before, and I found it a bit dry. Switched to a philosophy and politics degree, because that's the catch-all. If you find yourself in a degree you're not happy with, you'll just inevitably end up there. And so I ended up with this degree in philosophy and politics, and I then decided that I wanted to get into science, and I was stuck with this completely useless degree that couldn't take me there. And there were these things called transitional MScs, which are very intense MScs, which in theory can take you from the world of the arts or the social sciences to science proper. And because in this country, I think like Italy, we have this terrible, demarcation, and you're obliged to kind of, decide very early on whether you're in one camp or the other. And I think it's very divisive. But I managed to do this, what was called easy MSc, it was evolutionary adaptive systems. So I learned a lot about computer science and AI, and this is back in the early days. Enjoyed it, ended up doing what's called evolutionary robotics. So I was evolving robotic controllers, neural networks, all the stuff that's now hyper fashionable, deep learning. It was called neural networks back then. And it was, the computers were too slow probably to make great strides. I then got I got a PhD in computational neuroscience. I was sort of lucked out working with insect navigation of all things. So I was doing what's called Hymenoptera, which is bees and ants and bumblebees. I ended up doing a postdoc where I think technically, I think I can prove this. I was the greatest bumblebee trainer on earth. I think I still have that accolade. These bumblebees only live for so amount of times. There's only so complex an experiment you can do with them. I did a few other postdocs in various kind of robotic work, but I think once the bumblebee training, probably that was my peak. I mean, where do you go from there? So
downhill from there.
It was downhill from there. So I thought, well, that's it. Academia's done as much as it can for me. I'm the greatest bumblebee trainer on earth. I also wanted to travel a bit. There was this thing called the startup culture, and me and a friend decided to dip our toes in that. So I ended up with a couple of startup ventures. As far as I'm aware, they didn't end up as billion-dollar unicorns. I'm not,
not yet
anyway, unless my partner was keeping something from me. So that's the typical thing. You go in there and very few people come out enriched. And then I found myself with all these skills. In university, I'd been using this software called ProtoVis, which was written by a young man called Mike Bostock, and that eventually became D3. I think it's fair to say, I mean, Mike Bostock was very brave in choosing JavaScript, because back then it was a toy language. I think people don't appreciate just how far it's come. I love giving, when I do a talk I do quite a lot of talks to Python audiences, and I show them benchmarks which show that modern JavaScript can be 100 times faster than Python for certain complex n-body simulations, for example. So JavaScript's power was fascinating, the way it grew with the V8 compiler. Suddenly you could do all sorts of things in the web in JavaScript that were impossible. It was a toy language before. And this opened up a whole load of possibilities. I started playing in that field. I started learning advanced JavaScript. D3 was a big part of that, creating visualizations, giving talks, and deciding that it would be good to have a niche, because if you're a jobbing programmer, you just get, you tend to get just jobs from everywhere, and it's exhausting and not particularly fulfilling, and you inevitably end up with jobs which are soul destroying. And I thought it'd be nice to actually do stuff I quite enjoy and be paid for it. I guess that's the holy grail, right? And And I was fortunate enough to be able to get there. But through the medium of data viz, I think academics deal with data visualization all the time. That's what you have to do. Certainly in science, you have to. Data visualization is the way you take you take the results, you take those little nuggets of truth, and you present them. It's absolutely mandatory, and obviously it's now mandatory all over the world. And COVID seems to have accelerated that trend. So that's and so now I find myself as a freelancer, and I will, with any luck, I get to cherry pick a nice jobs, and occasionally being freelance, there's a certain amount of feast and famine, and you end up doing rather dry stuff. But it's essentially, I think, that the modern web context, the JavaScript's power has opened up so many possibilities. Stuff like Flourish just couldn't have existed possibly even 10, 15 years ago. There just wasn't the power for it. So so that's been very impressive to me. Excellent.
Thanks, Kyran. Yeah. And I mean, I'm very aware of time. And I mean, we could sit here for 3 hours. Well, I could. I don't know about you, but I could sit here for 3 hours and chat about this stuff. But I'm aware that we're reaching the sort of top of the hour. And I think just to close off, it'd be nice just to spend a few minutes just talking about kind of careers and the marketplace and opportunities that exist, because ultimately that's what the students watching this are seeking. You know, how do you get into this world? And now we've heard the backstories there and the different routes. And I think what was important for me as well, you know, it's not linear. Some of the subjects that you've discussed, that you studied, you've not ended up doing that thing. Some of the jobs, like Alan mentioned, journalism, don't necessarily mean that you have to have a journalism degree to get into or around that world. So there's lots of different routes. But I just want to start off very quickly with freelancing, because I think it is something that was raised by a few students about the getting into this. I'll come back to you for this, Vali. You talked there about the book that you worked on with James Ball, and I think that kind of thing is a really important milestone in any freelancer's career, which is that kind of step change in terms of profile and awareness. Would you have, just in a nutshell, very quickly, would you have any advice on getting into freelancing and why you enjoy it? I mean, I just love the independence and the autonomy, but why do you want to be a freelancer?
Well, I think, like, similar to you, I just really like the independence and being able to kind of like decide what's right for me in terms of like the type of projects that come in. When you're working for an agency, you need to do everything that comes in. Well, as a freelancer, you kind of have the privilege to decide what's right and what perhaps doesn't fit the type of work that you want to do. Again, said that though, like a lot of time is all about also compromising and, you know, paying the bills at the end of the month. I suppose, like, for me, a very important thing to make me jump to go freelancer was having the confidence that I kind of knew, although perhaps at the point I wasn't quite sure exactly what direction I wanted to focus, I knew how the business was working in terms of like, you know, having a good grip on how long something takes.
Yes.
And that only came with experience of designing with a group, with people that actually had more experience than me and learning from them. Because as a freelancer, you need to scope the project, you need to estimate the time and the effort that goes into it. And also, a thing that was important at that point was that while I was full-time, I did build a portfolio of work that could kind of demonstrate the type of work that I was passionate about. Again, not fully aware that I wanted to do data visualization. All those kind of like experimentation pointed out towards data visualization. And also is the kind of portfolio that led me to the opportunity of collaborating with HarperCollins on the book. So I think it's a matter of like just demonstrating the skills that you have. So, you know, like a degree obviously is a great starting point because you already have a really strong focus. A curriculum is great, but it's all about the work. The work really speaks for what you want to do and what you are able to do. So I do think that it's ultimately just about spending energy, time, and effort in something that you enjoy, that gives you joy, exploring subject matters that are important to you, other people will find it important too, that will resonate with others, and just really like, experimenting, because it's not until you actually try things out that you're going to know whether it's your path or things that are going to give you joy or not. You can have a sense, but it's not until you try it. that you will fully understand that. And for me, actually, self-initiated projects are something that I've been working on throughout my career. So I still do this sort of like experimentation for my own pleasure. And those are usually driving new business conversations. So very important.
Absolutely, yeah. And let me just say, I think what we'll do is we'll take a 10-minute extension. We'll finish at 10 past 10. If anyone needs to leave, both in the panelists and the attendees, don't worry, life goes on. But I think it's really important just to finish off this without rushing too much. And yeah, just to touch on that point, I think one of the things that I've learned from freelancing is, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of different skills or experiences that you need to learn. I mean, it's, you know, running a business, it's about marketing, it's about writing blog posts, it's about understanding finance and pricing and accountancy to a degree, right the way through to just being a professional and operating as a professional in meetings and with clients and all these things. And it's one of those things you've got to hold your nerve with. You don't get that until you get it. It's a chicken and egg thing. And so, you know, if you get an opportunity to go freelance, it's something that I genuinely believe is a fantastic way to operate, but it comes with risks. You know, I guess that there are rewards that come with that as well, but it is a risky business. And let me just say one little side note before we finish, before we reach the 10 o'clock mark, for which some people may need to go. One of the things that I've always held off doing over the last 10 years is bring somebody on board. I've always been a lone wolf. But just to say, for the benefit of the UCL students, one thing that I'm doing this year is an internship. I'm going to create an internship, a 9-month, probably, early days, a 9-month intern opportunity to work with me and to help me develop you. So it's a mutual benefit thing, hopefully. And this will be something that initially, at least, assuming people are interested, will be kind of offered to UCL students. So more on that to the students in due course, but that's something I'm going to take the plunge with and bring a second person on board. Now, I'm going to come to you next, Alan, because I'm thinking especially about your position in the organisation and your helicopter view about what opportunities exist. What's your, just very open question, but what's your view of the data viz marketplace as a professional, as in terms of opportunities? My sense is it's ever growing. And I think the coronavirus outbreak will only ever leave us with a legacy of more interesting data, more interesting charts. I mean, what's your take on where we are professionally?
I mean, I think the opportunities as a sort of aggregate thing have never been higher. We are used to seeing things now, which if you'd have said them 2 or 3 years ago would have seemed crazy. Like Gary Lineker tweeting that if there's any positive from 2020, it's that people have learned to read a chart, you know, like ex-footballers promoting data viz literacy. You know, this is a new thing. I think we're certainly at a stage now where, certainly for a lot of news organizations, charts and data visualization as a sort of vehicle for communication is now accepted, right? Like, I mean, I think that you no longer have to make that point. It's kind of generally assumed. I think when it comes to career opportunities in the field in organizations like the FT, and it also speaks very much for my time at ONS as well, actually, the one piece of advice I would give to people is, yes, learn the data viz skills, right? Like it's matured an awful lot in so many different ways, and there's a lot to learn. And it's a more difficult field to get to the top of now than it was a decade ago or 15 years ago. But please don't forget those human skills, which will be incredibly important on your journey. And one of the most important of the lot is empathy for the people that you will end up working with. And so, you know, both at ONS and at the FT, one of the things you really got to do when you're working, not as a freelancer, but as in an organization, is to understand the organization, right? You can't assume you can naively drop into any organization with your data viz super skill kit and just instantly transform everything you touch, right? Like that won't happen unless you really connect with the organization and understand not only what it's trying to do now, but where it's come from, like what its history is and that sort of stuff. And for me, that's the bit that's made it fascinating, to actually embrace that side of these organizations and to be part of the journey of an organization that will outlast D3, right? Like it will outlast, dare I say it, Flourish and Tableau. These organizations will be the longest vessels that there are for data viz. And so it's good to have opportunities to kind of guide it along the way.
Yeah, I think I'd completely concur with the idea of the difficulties of understanding organizations, culture, systems. I mean, I find working on consultancy gigs the hardest because every client's different. It's a little bit different when it comes to training, because in a sense you're setting the agenda, but consultancy gigs are always, I find, quite anxious making because everything's different and there's loads of nuance that you have to pick up on very, very quickly as well. Thanks, Alan. Coming to you, Cath. I mean, you know, in a sense, you've got a couple of hats here because your work is often to look at the marketplace and look at jobs and occupations and skills that come from that. But also you are a professional in this space and you're somebody who's got a radar for the subject at large. Again, in a nutshell, what's your take on the opportunities that exist in this world? And I'm not just trying to be a propagandist, you know, it's all cool, everything's growing, but I do feel it is. And is that something that you'd share the same view?
Yeah, I think so. We do have a lot more data scientists than we do have data visualization designers still. I think, I don't know, I think I see the field kind of splintering. Like there's lots of, you can now just be an expert in a particular type of kind of mapping, or you can be an expert in physical data visualizations or hand-drawn data visualizations. And I kind of see it going that way with more and more specialization. I see a lot more use of video too, and kind of animation and things, which is nice. And I see kind of more of the kind of artistic fields kind of merging together in data visualization. So now you don't just have text, chart, text, it's like lovely illustration, text, infographic, video, text, chart, text. It's, you're kind of blending all the mediums together, which I think is great. Just on, in terms of getting into the field or kind of making a start, I was trying to jot down some thoughts on like what I would do if I was in others' shoes and kind of starting again. I think the first step is to get a really good understanding of the field. So when you look at data visualizations, like your monthly list of data viz that have been produced, really look at the data viz and think, why does this work? And kind of identify and separate and kind of break down every component. What colors have they used? What font? What is your eye drawn to first? And so you don't want to copy others, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a really good understanding of all the different trends and the features in the data viz. And then what I'd do is come up with a side project and something that, for whatever reason, means something to you. And then I think the other thing that's kind of often underrated is feedback. So feedback is so important. So I would never publish a data viz. So I'd always send it out to colleagues. They don't do data viz themselves, but their feedback is so crucial because they can see it for the first time. Whereas I've spent kind of months looking at this data. I think my data viz is perfect. You know, everything's very obvious, but because it's never the case. So their feedback is so important. You've got to put a really high value on what they say and really consider every point kind of deeply. And then lastly, I would say that it's not a linear process. I think often in when we teach data viz, it's like you get the data, you do this perfect hand-drawn design, it's lovely, and then you code it up and it's perfect and you go on to win an award or something. But of course, it's not like that at all. I often go back and forth, I have to start again, the data changes, the deadline changes, something, and you really have to start from scratch. So don't be afraid to make big changes and to kind of change your mind about things. Those will be my tips.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to waste your time on something. Don't be afraid to explore data and find nothing, because nothing can be the story sometimes. So
that often happens, that you'll learn a skill that you'll kind of deploy somewhere 100%. Else. That's what I often find. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great stuff. Thanks, Cath. And I'm going to give Lyndsey the last chance. Sorry, the last word on this. What's you know, you've got the experience of Bank of England, you've got the experience now looking at Flourish and even the clients that you're working with at Flourish. Yeah. I mean, you must see the growth just through the growth in take up of Flourish.
I mean, this area, the growth in this area is absolutely immense. I can't believe, you know, when I started doing data viz, no one really talked about it. Now it's kind of like a buzzword. But just a couple of kind of things from me. One, I think learning the skill sets to be good at data storytelling and visualization will just set you off on a great road anyway, because when I think about the kind of merge of skill sets, it's very unusual to be good with numbers and data, as well as being good at design and communication. And so just having those kind of 3 sets of skills is, you know, will set you up for a great career. I honestly believe that. I've been really, it's been so interesting seeing how organizations are changing the types of jobs that they have. So there's loads of data journalist jobs within big institutions. I've seen them advertised in, you know, commercial banks like Barclays and HSBC. I mean, it seems kind of crazy, but everyone is cottoning on to the fact that you need to be good at explaining your analysis or your data for people to kind of act on it and be engaged in it. So I think you'd be surprised when you start digging in. The Bank of England has just advertised its first data journalism role as well. It knows it's kind of going down that route of merging kind of written communication with visual communication. So I think, you know, it's a good world to kind of go in. It's going to only grow. And from kind of Flourish perspective, certainly, Andy, I mean, we have so many huge clients that are you wanting to get much better at this field and data storytelling. I mean, you know, all the big consultancies starting to use Flourish, like McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, all the kind of OECDs and World Banks of the world, BP, all these big companies know that getting much better at this sort of is going to help them sell their products or their services. So, I mean, it's definitely a good field to be in. I think, you know, the next 10 years are going to be just as crazy as the last 10 years with things changing at pace. And just to put a final plug in, Flourish will definitely be having some internships coming up in the next few months. So if anyone's interested in doing an intern, we have 3 interns who will be, you know, guaranteed a job after. If you are interested in working at Flourish and you want to have a chat, then Andy, feel free to give out my email address. I'm really happy to have a chat with anyone about these things. So yeah, so I won't take up any more of the time, seeing as we're overrunning, but I'm happy to chat further afterwards.
Brilliant. No, that's a really nice summary, Lyndsey. I think you're absolutely right. I think, you know, let's face it, data is not going away. There'll be not any less data. And so the need to make sense of it, the need to communicate it clearly and effectively will only ever grow. So it's easy for me in the field to say that, but I do think it's a faithful sort of representation where this world is going. So we've reached 10:10, so I think we'll close things off there. Thank you to everyone for joining us, both live and in the recording. Thank you to those who submitted questions to help shape the topics, but thank you very much, especially to Lyndsey, to Cath, to Valentina, to Alan, and to Kyran. Take care, everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.